Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I have a great guest coming in, Edward Stringham. He's the Davis Professor of Economic Organizations and Innovation at Trinity College. He also has worked with Walter Block even 20 years ago. He's a current professor, and he's also, as he wrote to me, he's a fellow 20 hottest libertarian men award winner. I think he was lower on the list than me. And he actually just came out with a new book, which looks really great, called Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life. And that's been a big topic that we've had on in the past, is private governance. Of course, we've had on Suzanne Tarkowski-Tempelhoff a few times with BitNation. BitNation looks like it's really taking off now. Some of our next guests are actually going to be involved in talking about private governance as well. So this has become a very interesting and topical issue. So we're going to get into all of that. But Edward, before we get started, I got to ask you, how did you become an anarchist?
Oh, thanks. It's really nice to have you here, and I'm thrilled to be able to chat with you. So I've always been kind of into free markets and the idea that businesses can help people. And I was actually not really thinking about it too systematically before college. But when I started taking classes with Professor Walter Block, my favorite undergraduate professor, he would go through example after example and say, you know, one of the great things about markets is the producer has to serve the customer. He would then contrast with government and talk about how monopoly doesn't help people. But he didn't really extend the logic to what I was fully expecting. And so he would say he actually did not present the full case. And he would say, well, you know, a government should just do certain things like police and courts and military. And I was just thinking about that. In my college, we used to have, everybody would go to these parties, underage drinking would occur. And the cops would raid them, and they were always spoiling everybody's fun. And I was thinking, well, you know, this kind of sounds very similar to what Professor Block is talking about in class, where the government is not there to make sure people are happy, especially harassing 20-year-old kids. We're just having
the government is definitely not there to make sure you are happy. That's definitely not one of the things the government does.
So we needed to fight for our right to party.
Here they come now. I can hear the cops coming
out. They're right outside my window, hearing me say that. And so I was just really thinking, well, you know, they don't act in the same way that, for example, the on-campus security at my college, where it's a private college, they were very friendly. But the minute you step off campus, the police are quite maybe a little bit less friendly. So at one point I went into Professor Block's office. He asked us what we wanted to write our papers on, and I said to him, I'm thinking about writing about the following topic, and I wanted to run it by you. My topic is going to be called Why Libertarians Are Communists. And he's like, what? And he said, what do you mean by that? And I think I might have even said, why libertarians are commies. And he said, what are you talking about? And then I said, well, you're always talking about how the private sector, the voluntary sector, is always so much better than the coercive government sector. And why should we make exceptions to that for things like police and courts? And he said, he looked around and he said, step into my office. And he basically told me that there's two types of libertarians. There's some who believe in government monopoly over police and courts, and there's others who don't. So just started reading about it then, and it's been a great set of interesting research since to see how common this is. It's not just a science fiction idea. It's like actually very common to see private security, private rules and regulations everywhere in the world today. Even with governments, we see private rules and regulations. And to think it's not so far-fetched after all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, it's all happening. And one of our next guests, and I'm so glad to get him on, is Dale Brown of Threat Management, which is a private security firm, essentially private police in Detroit that's expanding all over the place now. And I was so thrilled because I've been following them for years because I was like, this is what we need more of. We need private policing, private security. And they do an amazing job. And but I was so worried he wasn't an anarchist because I saw him on his interviews and stuff, and he didn't talk about any philosophy, about political philosophy or anything, but he just sort of came across as probably being one of those sort of maybe libertarian, maybe sort of a constitutionalist Republican sort of type. And I contacted him recently, and I said I kind of sheepishly, because I really respect the guy a lot, I love what he's doing, and I kind of sheepishly just sort of asked, are you an anarchist? Or and he didn't respond right away. It was on Facebook messaging. And I said, I just want to ask if you believe you should have a ruler, a violent ruler, I said. And he wrote back, he said, not only do I not believe I should have a violent ruler, I don't want any rulers. And I went, oh, good, you're good. So he's going to be on Anarchast next. So that's going to be excellent, talking about private policing. Before we get into that, because I want to get more into that, it's also interesting that you're pretty much, one of your professors was the great Walter Block, Mr. Libertarian himself.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's, I wonder how many of his other students turned into anarchists.
Pretty good number, actually. There were 3 of us who went on to get our PhDs and are now professors now. So I know in that cohort, this was at College of the Holy Cross, we had some friends who've since gone on to become academics writing about a lot of these topics. And I know he's done very well after he was at College of Holy Cross, producing students at his current university, Loyola University New Orleans, and I know a ton of his students are now professors writing about this. So people like Emily Scarbeck, Nick Snow, Daniel D'Amico, there's just tons of great people out there who are into these ideas because of the influence of a professor like Walter Block.
Yeah, that's great. I just saw Walter, of course, here at Anarchapulco just a few weeks ago, and I've met him many times. Great, amazing person, and what luck for you to have him as a professor.
He's so funny and so kind and generous with his time. I'm grateful to be able to interact with a professor like that who can really change somebody's life in a very nice way, supportive way, and I'll always remember that.
Yeah, I love too that you sort of brought up, you said that, hey, maybe we don't need the government to do policing and courts. And he's like, let's go into my office to talk about this. Just got to keep this a little quiet because this isn't totally normally said.
Yeah, well, he I don't know if it had anything to do with him being less established, but he got into College of the Holy Cross relatively late in his career, so he actually was not tenured, and he unfortunately they didn't give him tenure at College of the Holy Cross, so he left the same year that I left, and since then I think that I don't know, maybe he's a little bit more outright about these things in his current classes, but I can always give him a hard time for that one.
Yeah, that's just great. I love Walter. He's great. He was so great here at Anarchapulco. He did a great debate on Austrian economics, and he'll go almost anywhere to talk about anarchy. And I believe he's in his 70s, and just nonstop. He just works nonstop. Really a great person. Talking about private policing and things like that, one of our other guests is just coming on that I'm super thrilled about as well. I've been trying to get on for a while, is the creator of the Cell 411 app, which is essentially an app that gets rid of any need for government police or any sort of government service. It's essentially an app, and we'll be talking a lot about this with Virgil Vaduva, who's going to be coming on with us. It's blowing up right now. It's doing incredibly well all around the world, and essentially what it is an app on your phone where you put all your friends and people you know on it, and when you have a problem, you just press the button and they know where you are. And when you press the button, you say what kind of problem you have. And most of the problems are actually going to be, and one of the buttons is, I've been pulled over by the police. So it's kind of funny because this app will essentially, hopefully, get rid of the police state and get rid of any need, or, well, there really is no need, but any sort of perceived need for government policing. But most of it's going to be used because you're being accosted by police. It's kind of that's the state of affairs right now, especially in places like the U.S. So much going on, and I think a lot of this has all sort of been involved in this sort of awakening. And I love the title of what you said you wanted to do your thesis on, which was that why are so many libertarians communists or commies? And I say the same thing whenever I talk to a Republican, because I love to always give them something that's just straight out of left field that will, kind of shock them into thinking, because they're obviously not thinking. So you'll talk to a Republican and they'll say, oh yeah, I love the markets and all that and free markets. And I'll be like, well, what about police and courts and military and things like that? And they're like, well, of course I love those things. And it's like, well, why are you such a communist? Why do you love communism so much? Because that essentially is communism. It's centrally planned. It's not a free market institution. And when you say things like that to people like Republicans or even libertarians, it can really get them, well, first of all, upset, which is fine, but then also get them to think like, yeah, why is it that I like communism for some things? And but a big part of the sort of the issue has been, well, what else is there? There is no other real solutions, right? And now we're seeing with people like Dale Brown of Threat Management expanding all over the place, Cell 411 app coming out. We're starting to see the market creating these solutions, which is beautiful.
Yeah, so I appreciate your approach of pushing people, but I actually think a lot of these ideas are a lot less radical than a lot of people assume, because they are used to things like private security. Unarmed private security is very pervasive. This is not science fiction. And also things like
well, there's way more private security than public police,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And then also things like even armed private police in certain jurisdictions allow that. Even at Harvard University, MIT universities, these great bastions of progressive thinking rely on private police rather than government police. So they have people who are basically partially trained in the state police academy, but they're hired by the university. So it's not that far-fetched. And if you look around the world, beyond security in the realm of contract enforcement, there's just so many mechanisms out there that everybody has experience with. Everybody has experience dealing with a credit card company, that if there's a dispute, they're going to act as the arbitrator or the arbiter of the dispute rather than relying on courts. So I'm fine with the term anarchy. I actually edited this book, Anarchy and the Law, but I don't think that one needs to even call oneself an anarchist to appreciate how common private rules and regulations are. And it's not like oh, this just happened in ancient Iceland. It's like very, very pervasive in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one thing that people just don't seem to notice or realize. And really, we're almost in anarchy right now in many, many ways. The government is still around, and they're still extorting people. And a lot of people are still getting extorted and actually pay those extortion fees, which I highly wish you wouldn't. I wish everyone would stop. And actually, I'm going to be working on something to try to get everyone in the world to stop paying taxes all in one day. And let's just shut this thing down right away. But people really just governments are still around, so people just assume that they're doing stuff that's good, but they're not really. Like, you look at the courts, right? Like, Does anyone ever had a problem and gone to a court and got a good resolution in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable amount of cost. Highly, highly, highly unlikely. Most 99% of people, if they go to court, it's to stand up against the government who's trying to extort them for some victimless crime. If you ever have another problem, it's usually the government trying to bring you into court to take away your rights in terms of things like family disputes and things like that. So a man will end up getting just charged with everything, and he has to pay the rest of his life, and a woman never has to. So, all these things are not great. Where's the really good court sort of system? And as you pointed out, most of this stuff is already done in the private market. Everyone uses things like eBay. That's all private. There's no cops involved. There's no courts involved. Same as you pointed out with credit cards, even though I hate the credit card system. But, it does have that sort of a facet to it of dispute management. So all these things most people already use, and the things that they think the government is there for rarely even works. Just bring up cops in the courts. The courts is, if you ever really want to do something in the courts, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's going to be years and years. It's usually never even worth the time or cost. And then with the cops, most of the time, they're just assaulting, killing, and extorting people. And even in the U.S., they had that recent stat that the cops are actually, with their what they call asset forfeiture, now steal more than all combined private criminals combined.
Oh, it's really sad. And I also calculated the cop kill rate against citizens, and it's actually tremendous. So if you calculate, it's around 150 deaths for every 100,000 cops per year. If you compare that to private individual kill rates in the United States, it's like 30 times lower. So it's really unfortunate the amount of people who get killed in the United States by cops. So the idea that they're there to protect people, that's something we can question. The other thing about the courts that you mentioned, if you're having a small level dispute with somebody over eBay and it's like you lost $10 in a trade, you can't call a lawyer, you can't establish jurisdiction, you can't waste time going to court over all these small transactions. With big business, on the same thing. If they're dealing with multi-million-dollar contracts, they don't want to have $1 million or millions of dollars tied up in the courts in this contract dispute, which is going to take years. So in both small cases and in large cases, people want to avoid the courts. They want to figure out how to solve things privately, and they've done that. So it's not a matter of, how theoretically could people solve disputes if government courts didn't exist? It's like, how do people solve problems right now? The vast majority of human interaction will never even see the inside of a courtroom for a contractual dispute or anything like that. Yet it's done privately.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually quite a beautiful time for us right now, because not only are we building all the systems that will get rid of the government, like I pointed out, Cell 411 and threat management, and there should be a lot more private court systems for all you anarcho-capitalists out there who want to make some money and also help people, which is the same thing. That's how you know you're helping people, is when you make a profit, is that to start up more private court systems. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever done this or thought of it, but if you're like a tech genius, get together get like all the top tech guys and get them to come onto a board of a private court system and say, let's go around to all the tech companies and say, if you guys have a dispute, so when you sign a contract with, say it's Google signs a contract with Apple or whoever it is, you say any dispute will be settled at this court, which is a private court, which has all of these amazing people on it who understand tech, unlike the government courts, which is pretty hilarious when these big, so many things are so complicated nowadays with tech and things like that. And they go to the courts and you just have a judge or a jury, which is, just as bad. A bunch of just idiots from the local community trying to figure out what's going on. So I could totally see a lot of tech companies signing up for that.
This does exist, not as a theoretical, but as an actual matter right now. I lived in Silicon Valley for 6 years, and I interacted with people who worked in this industry. Especially these very complicated potential disputes between technology firms. If you're assigned a random judge who just doesn't understand the most basic things, there's no way they're going to be able to actually help sort things out for you. So they actually would pay a premium to hire experts who are very knowledgeable in a particular area. And if you look at these arbitration clauses, they will often specify what type of arbitration tribunal in the clause, or when they choose the arbitrator, they'll say, well, we want to make sure somebody's an expert. And there's surveys of business where they say that's one of the main attractive features of arbitration, is being able to select somebody who has knowledge of this field rather than being thrown to some random judge who knows nothing.
Yeah, it's like a dispute between like Einstein and Nikola Tesla or something about some incredibly extreme concept of physics or something like that, and saying if we have a problem, let's go to like some idiot who knows nothing about physics and let him decide. It's like, why would you do that?
Yes, there's a great story out of PayPal, which I talk about in my book, Private Governance, where they were getting defrauded by quasi-anonymous fraudsters from all around the world. And at first they had no idea who it was. Eventually they figured out how to collect traces, and they kind of identified a couple of them. So at one point they went in to the FBI and they're like, all right, we've got evidence. Here it is. Check it out. And the FBI would be asking questions like, what's a banner ad?
Oh man, I've got a story about that. When I had an internet company, this is before I knew I was an anarchist or even understood the ideology in the 1990s. I had the top internet company in Canada, and we got hacked one day, and I didn't know what to do. And I got all my hackers on it. I had to drive around and pick them up at like 4 a.m. from their houses. They're like 15-year-old kids and stuff, but they were geniuses. And I'm like, we got to get in and figure out what's going on. And I was like freaking out because we were just about to raise like $10 million for my company, and the site was down, and we didn't know why, and all of our information was lost. We got it back, but I was sort of panicking at the time. I was like, did we just lose everything that we just about had, like a $100 million company here? And I called the police. Now this is hilarious looking back on it, because I would obviously not do that today, but I just, you're sort of almost trained that that's what you're supposed to do. So I called 911. So you can imagine this in 1997. I'm calling 911. Hello, what's your problem? Our website just got hacked. What's the website? It's like on the internet. Oh, I've heard of the internet. What do you want us to do about it? Well, I don't know, but is it, you guys are supposed to like fix, help us fix these problems, right? And they actually sent a cop down to the office, and the guy was just your typical beat cop. And he's like looking through the server room and looking at wires and stuff, and he's like, so what did you say happened again? And I'm like, well, somebody hacked in and like shut us down and stole all our information. He's like, okay, so how'd they get in? I'm like, well, through the internet. And he's like, what's the internet? And I'm like, oh my God, forget it. And but that's really the case. It's just these people just don't know it. There's not of any help in any way.
Yeah, that's right. So one can assume, there's a lot of people assume that government is at the forefront of technology. They're at the forefront of knowledge about how markets work, about economics and finance. As a practical matter, at best, they're going to be responding to things way after the fact. And in many cases, I chatted with another guy who worked for a security firm in Silicon Valley. He said, yeah, in my opinion, they're at least 10 years behind what's going on. So you do have, in modern times, very sophisticated government, the spy machine, but that's not enforcing contracts on the internet. That's not protecting companies' assets on the internet. It's really serving a governmental set of objectives. And the idea that businesses can rely on calling the cops to solve their problems is just an assumption that many people have, which I think is wildly unrealistic.
Yeah, it's really outdated, and that's getting back to where I was saying it's such a beautiful time right now, because not only are we getting all these new systems coming into place and a lot of people realizing that these should be all private sector sort of facilities or duties, so they're building all that, which is amazing. We're seeing all that. Even Bitcoin is a great example of that. They've created a new money outside of the government and central banking system that cannot be shut down. It's beautiful. All this stuff is being built. So at the same time that we're building all this amazing stuff, all the old stuff is just falling apart. We're seeing the police state, and that's also being exposed as well by a lot of anarchists. People like Cop Block with Pete Eyre, who was a past guest on Anarchast. They've got literally millions of people watching them, and they expose the cops every time that they do a brutality or murder or shoot someone's dog, and they've got the video and everything. So they're exposing, and the system is just falling apart. It's just any communist, any centrally planned system, any system without a profit motive or a way to see if they're actually doing anything good will never succeed. That's been proven countless times in history, and it's just all falling apart. So we have the system falling apart and a new system being built right now. It's actually just an incredible time.
Yeah, there's so many interesting new technological advances. I talk about in my book how PayPal had to solve this problem of online fraud. And once they realized you can't deal with it through the courts, you can't deal with it through the law, they implemented a system to predict and prevent fraud before it occurs. So they use a combination of artificial intelligence coupled with human intelligence to say, all right, this transaction is likely legitimate, this transaction is likely fraudulent, requiring additional bits of information. They were one of the first people to have a commercial implementation of CAPTCHA, where you have to type out these odd letters. And then by doing that, they actually shut the hackers down, the fraudulent hackers down. And nowadays, we have a fraud loss ratio of PayPal of 0.5%. So the more effective you can come up with a solution to prevent problems from occurring, the more irrelevant the inefficacy of government courts become. There's even some new technology now which I think has tremendous potential. It's based on what are called smart contracts, which is related to Bitcoin, built off of Bitcoin technology.
Built off the blockchain, yes.
Yeah, the blockchain technology, where you can have these basically automated verification of when a certain event occurs. Then the system is going to basically check off this box and says, yep, this happened, you are owed your money. So for example, in a betting contract, you know who wins the sports event, and then the winner of the betting event automatically gets that money transferred to him or her. So you don't need to go to court. You also don't need to go to the local bookie to threaten private force. It's all going to be done, and as it is done, the great thing about business is figuring out how to do things in a very seamless way without relying on force.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing things like marketplaces pop up. Of course, the first sort of attempt at that did really well was Silk Road by an anarchist, Ross Ulbricht. He has been kidnapped and put into a torture camp for the rest of his life. Well, actually, I don't think it's going to be the rest of his life. I think we're going to get him out. But he's there right now. But the big weakness with that was that it was centralized to some extent. And they've just come out, actually. I just saw just the other day, Open Bazaar, which is a completely uncentralized. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's all basically essentially on the blockchain, or essentially it's not centralized, just went live. So this is going to be a private sort of eBay where you can buy or sell anything you want, and a lot of the things will be similar to those sort of smart contracts. It'll all be automated. There will be no potential for disputes, really. And so more and more these systems are being built up that just make it so anything that anyone thought there was any last vestiges of need for government, which if you're like me, I don't think there ever was any need, but if people think there was still a few needs for it, they're just being outdated right now. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next few years as this continues to go. We're going to see the private systems continue to build and be used, and we're going to see the old system getting worse and worse and more tyrannical. It'd be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, so the examples you give are kind of at the edge of some illicit products that I would personally never be involved with. But the interesting thing is that this is also widely used for what are now considered completely mainstream products, stock markets, equity transactions. Everybody now would agree stock markets are good for channeling money from investors to companies so they can share in potential equity growth. But when they first were invented, basically 400 years ago, the governments didn't understand them. They viewed them as forms of gambling, in much the way you talked about some of these more illicit markets. And so because of this, people said, all right, we could not do them, or we're going to do it anyway. And luckily, those people back then ignored the law, and they started a secondary market for shares. They traded options, short sales, forward contracts, even though government thought they were all forms of gambling. So the most mainstream contracts, the things that we now consider, oh, of course we're going to have stock markets, of course we're going to have the ability to buy and sell shares. These are developed privately. So I think that if you look at innovation historically and today, the forefront of this is done through these private marketplaces who are trying to figure out how to prevent problems like predation and fraud, and basically making the modern world possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Another past Anarchast guest and a person who spoke at Anarchapulco just a few weeks ago is Chris Horlacher, who's doing something I believe is called Equibit, essentially trying to put all the stock markets onto the blockchain. All this stuff is happening. It's really incredible. This is really where it's at. If you're not watching this podcast and not getting some money-making ideas, you're falling asleep at the wheel. There's so much potential to change the world right now, and at the same time make money doing it. And it's all happening in this sort of space. It's really interesting because I don't know about you, Edward, but I think you've been an anarchist for like 10 or 20 years, I believe. But it used to be there was not very many anarchists, and the ones there were all broke. And now, thanks to things like Bitcoin and all these new developments, a lot of anarcho-capitalists are out there, and they're all doing very well, creating this private, decentralized world.
Yeah, so Bitcoin, I'm rooting for its success, and I hope it takes off. But even if Bitcoin in its current iteration is not successful, there's so much potential to be built on its underlying technology in much the same way that, we don't have RCA television or Zenith television around, but we have modern computers which have supplanted that. And I think that some of this blockchain technology has so much tremendous potential. You've got mainstream financial institutions looking at this as a way of settling trades rather than having to wait a few days or even a few weeks after the fact. Actually, instantaneously, I know that you have the shares, you know that I have the money. The instant that we make this agreement, there's settlement date. This has been an issue that people have been grappling with for hundreds of years, figuring out, should we have quarterly settlement dates, monthly settlement dates, weekly settlement dates. Now it's done in this new space. They can do it instantly. And mainstream financial institutions, including JP Morgan, are investing billions of dollars looking at these new types of technologies. So it's not like these ideas are that out there that it's for a bunch of hippies hacking in their parents' basement. I think that these ideas have already created so much value for the world, and there's so much more value that can be created in the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny just using, and you mentioned Bitcoin might not exist a few years from now. It's totally possible. It is sort of the first real attempt at a cryptocurrency. It's doing quite well though. It's amazingly well actually. Just watching how it gets through every problem it's had. It's currently going through sort of the forking sort of block size issue, which is just another issue and of many that it's had along the way, and it always seems to get through it through a complete voluntary meritocracy. There's no one person deciding. It's really the market deciding. It's really beautiful. And you're right. It could fail at some point, but cryptocurrencies are not going away, and this entire concept is is not going away at all. It's growing dramatically, and as you mentioned, billions of dollars are being put into this now. So, and you know, some people are going to have nefarious interests in it. People like Morgan Stanley, of course, but you just can't deny this technology. It's just it's unstoppable, and it's everything's going to be changing over the next few months, weeks, years, and decades for sure. And it's an interesting time to be alive and watch all this and to see how this all works out.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that a Morgan Stanley is interested, or J.P. Morgan rather, they're showing that there's not just a small potential, but a very wide-scale potential for not just having settlement of money transactions, but settlement of stock transactions, settlement of privately held shares in a company can be on a distributed ledger. And so as this technology increases, as people can start basically knowing that they're going to get paid, they're going to get the goods instantly, and you can have third-party verifications added on to that, whether private or, I mean, if somebody loves government, they could even say, yeah, I want to have this transaction somehow enforced in government court. But the more that you have this, the less need, like theoretically, there's no need to go to a government court when you have the goods, the goods instantly settled, where there's no potential for people from taking their half the bargain and then absconding and then saying, I'm sorry. So these types of solutions, which we've had some great innovations for in the past through things like London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, have been at the forefront of these things 200 years ago, 100 years ago, figuring out how to make transactions work even when government doesn't enforce them. As this technology improves, it's just going to prove the efficacy of markets and the non-need for relying on this government external party to enforce contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, just more and more every day, I realize how archaic the old systems are. For example, banking. When I need to send some funds to someone, I send through Bitcoin. It's almost instantaneous, although it's been a little slow lately, a couple minutes or whatever. But it doesn't matter if it's Sunday night at midnight. I press a button and a guy in China's got money. And then when I have to send it and they don't want Bitcoin or don't know what Bitcoin is or don't accept it, send it through the banking system. It's like, okay, well, I have to wait till tomorrow. It's Sunday. I can't do it on the weekend. Send it on Monday, and then it usually takes a few days and costs a bunch of money, and usually they'll have problems with it and call and why are you sending this and who is this person and we need more information. And I got an email from one bank that I use just the other day, a bank in Canada, and Canada has a form of sort of fascism in the banking industry, as many countries do. So they only allow really 5 major banks in Canada, which has really just made it just a horrible, horrible banking system. And it's really just terrible to use. It's so far behind banking systems I've used in places like Latvia or Singapore or any other place like that. And they sent me an email the other day and they said, you know, it was just a sort of a spam email sending to all their clients. And they said, just to let you know that as of next week, we will not be accepting wire transfer requests by fax anymore. And I wrote them back and I said, I thought fax died in the 1980s. And but actually, up until a couple of years ago, that was the only way they accepted. Still, to this, you know, up until a couple of years ago, that was the only way they accepted a wire transfer is through fax. So that I had this e-fax service. I didn't want a physical fax machine. I just felt like a total idiot if I had one of those sitting in my room, and send them our wire transfer via fax, which is just crazy. But yeah, so all these systems, and you brought up the stock markets as well. All those, even with stocks, if you don't trade stocks, people out there don't trade stocks, you won't know. But if you sell a stock, you don't get the money right away. It's usually about 3 days. And even when you buy stocks, you never really actually own it. They never actually put it in your own name because it would take far too long to transfer the stock certificates all around and everything. They put them in something called street name. So if the brokerage actually goes bankrupt, you don't own that stock, and that stock can go down with the brokerage. Not many people know that, and that will happen in the future, by the way. But all these systems are quite archaic and really falling behind. And that's why you're seeing people, organizations like NASDAQ, investing a lot into blockchain-related companies to figure out how to do these things much better. So all these things are all changing right now. It's just an amazing time.
Yeah, the history of innovation in financial services has been amazing ascent for the past 400 years. And in economics, there's this whole thinking, this set of theories that assume that government is like a chicken that hatches the egg of markets. Well, I think that's completely wrong. I actually would liken government more to salmonella, where it is associated with chickens, it's associated with eggs, but it is not the cause. It did not hatch the eggs of markets. When you look at the innovations that took place in the first stock markets of futures, the equivalent of futures contracts and forward contracts, options contracts, 400 years ago, the idea that you've got these government regulators planning markets 400 years ago, it's just so wrong. And then if you look at what's going on today, there's so much innovation, so much financial deepening that's been taking place over the past couple decades, and there's so much more that needs to be made. And it's done privately. It's not like Barney Frank is like there. He's like, what's the future of technology? It's like these government officials don't really, I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think these government officials really understand economics. They don't understand finance. They're not at the cutting edge of anything.
That is totally not controversial.
So when you see things done, it's done privately. It's done through the marketplace. And the amount of innovation that can take place and continue to take place is just going to be phenomenal if the past is any guide.
Yeah, and we've seen in like the stock markets, I do a lot with the stock market, especially at the Dollar Vigilante, and I've been around them for 20 years. And so many companies are just not even going public anymore because there's too much hassle, there's too much regulation, and the regulation of the stock markets has so much cost now. There's just so much legalities and lawyers and accountants and all to make sure, that the investor's protected. But, most of the cost of these smaller companies, and that's where a lot of the innovation comes from, is the smaller companies, goes just towards the adhering to the regulations. So it's really stifling it. But now we have things like Bank to the Future and all kinds of crowdfunding ways to raise money, and everything's changing. It's really a phenomenal time.
Yeah, the idea that these regulations are helping the investor. Well, the regulations have tremendous cost for the company, and that actually comes out of the profits of the company. So it's the investor who's paying for the cost of these regulations. And the investor is not the one who's actually demanding the regulation. It's some, senator who's come up with some harebrained scheme, Sarbanes-Oxley or Dodd-Frank, who's like, I've got this great idea. If we just enact this regulation, I'm going to prevent the next round of fraud, or I'm going to prevent the next economic downturn. And we can see how ineffective they've been in the past. And I'm quite sure, even after this monstrous Dodd-Frank, which is tremendously burdensome on the economy, on the financial sector, I'm quite sure after the next economic fluctuation, there's going to be a lot of people say, see, markets did it. There was no regulation. That's why we have this economic downturn, because we didn't have regulation. Whereas they're not realizing that their regulations are backwards looking. They're just simply adding costs to the cost of going public. So the idea that government is there to help people, the idea that government is helping the investor, is something that we just need to completely question, this whole mentality.
Oh, absolutely. It's I've seen it from the inside for decades, how the regulatory agencies just really ruin everything. They don't protect anyone. All the major frauds that have happened, they've never stopped any of them. Talking about things like Bre-X in Canada, the largest mining fraud, they never found that out. It was all found out by private people figuring out what was going on. Things like, who was that recent one in the U.S., the New York... Madoff. Yeah, they didn't just stop that. They actually probably knew about it. A lot of these regulatory agencies, they work with a lot of the other companies. Most of the time what I see is these regulatory agencies just cause problems, and most of the real things that are actual real problems, they just let it slide because they're all sort of working together. It's really ridiculous. I've never seen a regulatory agency help or solve any problem in the market.
Yeah, there was a private analyst named Markopoulos who actually, his fund had an investment strategy similar to what Madoff claimed to have had, and Madoff was claiming that he was earning 1% returns per month with no down months ever. And so this guy was like, well, that's interesting. I wonder if my firm could replicate this. And he said within 5 minutes, he said, this just can't exist. And he said within 2 hours, he proved mathematically that it is not actual returns. And so he started doing research and put together multiple reports, sent them to the SEC saying, look, this is a huge Ponzi scheme. And the SEC basically didn't really understand what was going on, and they overlooked it. So at the same time we have the SEC, you have private people who actually provided services that could have prevented that, and they actually did prevent it for the vast majority of companies. And it's called third-party custodian accounting services, where hedge funds, even though they're not publicly traded, you can have a third party look at your books every day. You can have a third party be the custodian of the account and actually holding those shares. So the hedge fund manager has no ability to actually take money out of those accounts. Before Madoff, the majority of investors and hedge funds used those services. After Madoff, now it's like 90-something%. All investors say, I demand these services. So there was a private solution in place. Government had their alleged way of weeding these things out. They couldn't do anything about it. And so now the solution is just to continue to add more government regulations, even though they couldn't do anything about it to begin with.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And, who has the most reason to be paying attention to whatever they're investing in to make sure it's not fraudulent? It's the people with the money in the company. It's not the regulatory agencies at all. Yeah. And as you pointed out, half the time they're just corrupt. They're on board with the frauds, which has been proven so many times. So many times when they ever look into these frauds, the people involved are at the regulatory agencies. And the other half of the time, these people who are working at these regulatory agencies, the reason they're there is because they're idiots. They can't get a job in the private market. They're not very smart. So they're all a bunch of bureaucrats, and they can't figure anything out. And so people just really have to take control or charge of their own life is really what it's all about. And that's one of the other problems with these regulations and stuff is people have this false sense of security. They figure, well, it's being regulated, so I'm sure I don't have to look into it myself, which just makes everything even worse. I don't have to convince you. You understand what I'm talking about, but a lot of people just don't get it still. But that's anyway, right. Edward, it's been great talking to you. You're very interesting.
Such a pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm really glad to have had this conversation.
Yeah, I know you were almost coming down to Anarchapulco. We just couldn't work it out at the last minute. I didn't really fully know you until just a few weeks beforehand when Mark Victor introduced us, and we were trying to get you down here, and it just didn't work out. But I hope you can come for Anarchapulco 2017, which will be amazing by the looks of it.
Sounds great.
Great. Why don't you let people know where they can get your book, anything else that you want to let them know about how they can follow any of your work?
Sure. My book is Private Governance. It's available from Oxford University Press, also from Amazon in real book form. You can also get the Kindle version. And you can also follow some of my posts on Twitter, on Ed Stringham on Twitter. So thanks so much.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll put the links to that down below to the how you can buy the book on Amazon. Check it out. Hopefully you'll see Edward at Anarchapulco 2017, which is, we already have the dates. I forget what they are, but we'll have them soon, February of next year, which we're already planning for it because this year was so amazing. We're just amazing time to be in this entire space. So much innovation going on. So many people just waking up and doing so many incredible things. And the world really is changing. It's a big change since when I started this in 2011. Back then, there wasn't a lot of major changes going on, but it's really going exponential now. So it's a great time to be in this entire space of the free markets. Let's get rid of government. It's an unnecessary evil. It is just once we can get rid of that, get people out of the mindset that they need it for any reason, and we can build those systems so they understand that there's way better ways to do things. We'll have a much more peaceful and prosperous world. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe, share down below. That's how you can share this information so we can get more people to wake up and we can get this world fixed and get rid of these governments and taxes and laws and regulations and wars and inflation and all this horrible stuff. So that's it for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
Well, there's like an ego-based kind of conscious block to prevent yourself from going deep within yourself because you don't want to hurt yourself. But sometimes you need to understand the subconscious kind of pains, the experiences you had in order to deal with them. A lot of people in society suppress a lot of bad emotions instead of embracing them. And I think once you kind of get into this world, once you start kind of experimenting and learning and taking different substances, you learn to embrace the bad just like you do the good, not suppress.
Croatia still recognizes that this piece of land belongs to Serbia, and that Serbia already said that it is not their piece of land and they don't mind creation of Liberland on this territory, which was a very strong statement only 11 days after we started the country. And we are still, enjoying the benefits of that. We do have a kind of a silent support from Serbia for Liberland, and we are trying to multiply it. And we have a strong belief that with the new government, which is much more pro-liberty than the past one, which was rather socialist one.
From Acapulco, Mexico, this is Anarchast.